Next item on today's calendar is by Senator Goodwin. Senate Bill S-13 Sub A, an act relating to education. Madam Whip.
Thank you, Mr. President and members of the Senate. At its core, this legislation is about giving the General Assembly the opportunity to review the current funding structure which draws from traditional public schools. This legislation is about saving traditional public schools. It's about ensuring the children currently attending those public schools here in Rhode Island are not left behind. Providing access to quality public education is for all students, including those in our traditional schools. And this needs to be the highest importance for us here in the General Assembly. But the recent preliminary approval of 5,835 new charter seats would drain more than $92 million in funding from our traditional schools. Sending districts would be charged $25.4 million on top of losing state aid of approximately $66.9 million. The fact is that any increase to the number of seats at charter schools inherently draws financial resources from our traditional public schools. We here today need to pause. We need to re-examine our funding formula to ensure that students in traditional public schools are not left behind. This legislation is about saving not only Providence schools, but schools and districts across this state, which have felt such a severe strain on their resources. I would like to just make a few points regarding the structure of this bill and the approval process for these charter schools. First, I want to point out this is not a new bill. This legislation was introduced by me and many members of the chamber last session. And it was part of a public dialogue as proposals to expand the charter schools were beginning to talk about and get underway. The Department of Education and those seeking charter expansions are well aware that these expansions are under review and that they are not certain. The new schools received preliminary approval in December, but it was only preliminary. It is not final. The new schools have yet to have their lotteries held to recruit students. The lotteries are normally held in and about April 1st. Lotteries have not been held either for any of the expansions. Existing state law makes the creation of new charter schools contingent on the General Assembly's appropriation. This is nothing new. This law has existed for a decade. The provisions enabling General Assembly approval was put into law when charter schools cap was increased during the race to the top legislative activity a decade ago. The Assembly funding approval requirement for new charters was a trade for raising the charter school cap, and we've done that. The prior charter school cap was originally 20 charters and no more than 4% of the population. Rhode Island has already exceeded both of those caps. The new cap is now 35 charters with no percentage of student caps in the law. While this may be the first time that this law has been invoked, the law already requires Assembly funding for any expansion to go forward. This bill is simply the first time the law has been invoked since it was enacted in 2010. It's certainly within the constitutional authority of us here as a member of the Rhode Island General Assembly to make funding decisions, and we know that, about future education spending. Mr. President, for the sake of the students in public schools all across the state, I move passage of this very important bill that will put a pause on the expansions of new and existing charter schools for a period of time from 2021 through 2024. Again, I move its passage. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Good. The whip moves passage of the act. Is there a second? Second by Leader McCaffrey. Senator Sosnowski, Senator Casada, Senator DeMario, Senator Gallo, Senator Felix, Senator Pearson, Senator Picard, Senator Coleman, Senator Lawson, Senator Mack, Senator Burke, Senator Anderson, Senator Mendes, Senator Archambault, Senator Cano, Senator Corkin, Senator Bell, Senator Murray, Senator Oyer, Senator Valverde, Senator Coyne, Senator Palmer, Senator Coleman, Senator Casada, Senator Anderson, Senator Murray, Senator Lombardo, Senator Feelag again. On the act, Senator Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. President. This bill, I am going to be voting against, and I'm going to discuss this shooting from the hip. There's so many things I can go on and on and on and on. But first of all, there's a reason why there's a lot of people trying to get into charter schools. And that reason is we're not doing a good enough job with our public schools. We have failed there. So at least they have that opportunity to have a choice. And let me talk about opportunities. I was fortunate enough to grow up in my town several generations, and I'm lucky enough to have a great school system. Not by choice, but by where my parents, my forefathers, decided to live. It wasn't always great, but we've come a long way in my community. There are other people that live in communities that aren't afforded the great education, but they have a possibility in the funds to send their kids to private schools. Then you have the third rail. You have those people that don't have that opportunity, and the ones that need it the most, that can't afford to send them to private schools, or aren't living in a community that has a great school. And their hope is the charter schools. And like I said, there's a reason why there's a demand for that, because we're not doing our job. And I relate this to the big auto companies. Whenever a new guy shows up on the block, the answer is, instead of letting them compete and try and get a big product, we stamp them out. And I think it's stamping out charter schools, and it's not the right way to go about it. If we were doing our job, the lottery system wouldn't be full of people trying to get into them charter schools. So I don't think we should stamp them out or try and delay them. I think we should provide a better product, and I don't think this is the way of doing it, so I'll be voting no on this bill. And again, I'd like to say the state motto is hope. And if this passes, you're going to take a lot of hope away from a lot of kids and parents that that's all they have, because they can't afford to live in a community with schools, or they can't afford to send their kids to a private school as an alternative. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rogers. Senator Mack.
Hi, I'd like to thank Whip Goodwin for introducing this bill. This was a really hard one for me to personally support. As an educator and someone who has worked at a charter school, have friends and family who work at charter schools, I've received countless emails, text messages, and have countless phone calls with families. And it really reminded me of the movie Waiting for Superman, which is talking about the California education system, which charters are a great option for some families, but it should not be the only option. We should be working on making sure that each and every one of our public schools are great options. Right now, our families do not have authentic and real choice, because their choice is either putting their young people into charter schools or sending them to the failing public schools. I think this also will start the conversation of what we can do to make sure that all of our public schools in every single community, no matter how much money or resources they have, are preparing our young people for quality and great education. Thank you.
Senator Lawson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I too would like to thank Whip Goodwin for introducing this bill. And as I have shared many times in this chamber, I'm a social studies teacher at East Providence High School, the school I graduated from, the community I reside in and represent. It's a diverse community, full of and known for townie pride. It is from that perspective that I would like to share my concerns with all of you today. Public education is a common good, and I know it's important to all in this chamber. This bill calls for a pause on charter school expansion and funding, and that is the appropriate public policy at this moment. Our focus now should be on safely navigating our students through this pandemic that has impacted every part of life, social, emotional, economic, and it's significantly disrupted learning for all students, regardless of school and zip code. Diverting funds to a parallel school system dilutes that focus. When it comes to education policy, right now we need to focus our energy, efforts, and resources on the educational, social, emotional needs of our students. Our students are struggling. I see it, I hear it, I see the icons on my screen daily. I receive messages, and I also see it in person. And we need to listen to classroom teachers, those who are interacting with our students. They are the best and most knowledgeable resources we have to see what the priorities of our students should be, to meet their needs, to fill in gaps as a result of over a year of disrupted learning and living environments. This is a real concern and where our focus needs to be as we move forward in addressing educational concerns here in Rhode Island for our students. Educators want nothing more than to be back in person, learning with their students face to face to ensure that they have what they need to succeed. So let's focus on ensuring our schools maintain the resources in which they need to safely reopen. This bill is the best course of action to help make that happen, and I ask you all to vote in favor of it.
I want to remind my colleagues that we have a strict mask requirement on the campus here, and to please mask up even when you're talking on the mic. Thank you. Senator Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. President. With the whip's permission and the chair's permission, I'd like to offer an amendment. I'd like to move LC 000433/2.
Senator Pearson moves an amendment LC 000433/2, seconded by Leader McCaffrey and Senator Goodwin.
Mr. President, if I may, this is a technical amendment.
Discussion on the amendment. Senator, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is a technical amendment. On page 5, line 3, we add the word public after the language charter and also insert the statutory reference to that. In the law, there's a charter public school. Actually, make sure that you incorporate all 3 types of charters: district charters, independent charters, and rural academies. This is just meant for clarity to ensure that we're talking about all types of charter schools, and I would move the amendment.
Senator Pearson moves the amendment, seconded by Senator McCaffrey, Senator Casada, Senator Murray, Senator Lombardi, Senator Cano, Senator Oyer, Senator DeMario, Senator Lawson, Senator Coyne, Senator Gallo, Senator Sosnowski, Senator Goodwin, Senator Seveny. Discussion on the amendment. We have 3 lights lit. Is on the amendment? No. On the main bill? On the amendment, the clerk will please unlock the machine. Have all members recorded their vote on the amendment? Clerk will lock the machine. There are 34 votes in favor, 0 opposed. The amendment passes. Senator Goodwin moves the act as amended. Seconded by Senator McCaffrey, Senator Gallo, Senator Casada, Senator Lombardi, Senator Archibald, Senator Cano, Senator Corcoran, Senator Bell, Senator Anderson, Senator Murray, Senator Oyer, Senator Valverde, Senator Coyne, Senator Seveny, Senator DePalma, Senator Coleman, Senator Pearson, Senator DeMario, Senator Sosnowski, Senator Lawson, Senator Miller, Senator Burke, and Senator Bell. On the act as amended, Senator Casada.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to commend with women for this legislation. I want to address Carmen May claiming that this vote, we are denying family the right to choose where they send their kid to school. This is not accurate. Charter schools do not offer a true choice. Charter schools have the advantage to decide which kid get in and which kid get left out. They have the advantage to minimize the number of special needs students who can go there. We can't continue to hope that maybe some of our kids will get a better education if they happen to win a lottery to enter one of the greater charter schools. It's not all charter schools are the great, while the rest of our kids are left behind in public school, with even less fun and less resources for them than before. The education of our children should not be up to a lottery. We must focus all our energy in making the difficult decision to improve the quality of education for all our children, not just for few lottery winners.
Thank you, Senator Casada. Senator Dela Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. President. These charter schools have spent a lot of money to dot their I's and cross their T's. Kids have been promised admission into these schools. Parents are expecting their child to go to certain schools. Aren't we all about equity and fairness? Is this fair to children that are in failing schools? Before I even begin my remarks, I'm going to give you a personal story about myself, which I can relate to a lot of parents. And that my 3 boys, I had tried to get them into a charter school. And I know the disappointment that one has when you receive the letter that says your child's on a waiting list. Because I couldn't, in good conscience, send my children to the school district that I was living in. Thank God I live in North Smithfield now, and we have a great school system there, great low taxes, open green spaces, but not every family can move to a different district. I couldn't afford to send my kids to private school, so my choice was homeschool, was public school, and charter school, or move, and at the time I couldn't move. And there are many families in that same situation, where they'd like to go to a different district, but they can't. I listened to hours of testimony in the Education Committee. Parents, guardians, teachers, administrators, even an 11-year-old boy pleaded with the committee to vote down the moratorium on charter schools. People testified in Spanish. Do you understand the desperation to call in and not even speak the language, but begging to have these schools continue because they are the hope for these families? Charter schools have been one of the few bright spots for many Rhode Island children and their families. Why would we want to halt that success? Because it's more about the financial impact on the public school system, not on what's best for children. Even though charter schools technically are in themselves public schools. And while we might want to blame charter schools for the financial problems plaguing districts like Providence, the reality is a moratorium on charter schools is not going to fix the problem. Instead, it sends the message that the purpose of the school system is to serve the staff and not the students. I remind everyone, a little over a year ago, the Johns Hopkins report revealed that the failure of Providence public schools making it among the worst in the nation. We make that list quite often. To quote Johns Hopkins report, students in Providence public schools aren't learning much. Bullying, fighting are rampant. Bad teachers are nearly impossible to fire, and a thicket of bureaucracy makes it difficult to know who's in charge. Based on their direct observations, they found 90% of students do not score proficient in math. 86 are not proficient in English. The great majority of students are not learning on or near grade level. Teachers are demoralized and feel unsupported. Parents feel shut out of their child's education. Principals find it very difficult to demonstrate leadership. Many of the school buildings deteriorating across the city, some even dangerous to students and teachers' well-being. Some conditions were so dreadful that seasoned members of the Hopkins team broke into tears while visiting crumbling school buildings. Whole pages could have been dedicated to the complaints from both principals and teachers about the district's collective bargaining agreement. We can't get rid of bad teachers. It's a slap in the face to teachers who come here every day to do a good job. It's demoralizing. No one can lay off teachers. Ineffective teachers get shuffled. Displacement process, and they use an expletive. When asked by reporters whether or not she would send her own children to public schools in the city, Commissioner of Education Angelica Infante Green said no. It's hard to reconcile that despite our best expectations, above average per pupil expenditure, our government exhibits a lack of urgency when it comes to the education in this state. Quite simply, children must come first, and Rhode Island families deserve more choice in their education. These kids get one shot at a good education. Eleanor Roosevelt said, "Life is like a parachute. You got to get it right the first time." And we can no longer allow a child's zip code or a family's wealth to determine the quality of a child's education. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator De La Cruz. Senator Bell.
Thank you so much to everyone who's worked so hard to get this bill to the floor today, both within this chamber and without. What is a charter school? All a charter school is a school where there is no longer direct democratic control over who the principal is going to be and how the school is run. That's all it is. It's a school where there's a nonprofit corporation that's approved by state regulators that comes in and runs the school. It's fundamentally a question about democracy and a question about governance. Democracy is messy. There are times, sometimes, when it doesn't give us the result we always want. And there are times when taking an approach that sidesteps democracy can lead to better outcomes. There are cases of good charter schools that can outperform the public schools, but those are schools that mostly try and take an innovative idea that hasn't been put into effect and use this governance model to put that innovative idea into effect. Schools like the International Charter School or the Met School. But then there's also another way this governance model that has less democracy is applied, and that's to go after the rights of the students and the workers at the school. Some of these schools, workers work longer than 8-hour days, don't have the protection of a union, and don't have adequate health and medical benefits. Some of these schools, including one of the ones that was just expanded in Providence and another one that was proposed to come into Providence, illnesses are not an excused absence. There's a disciplinary code in which students are taken away their rights to free speech and rights to free expression. Many of the basic democratic rights that are core to our democracy are removed from how these schools are run. And they are not ultimately accountable to parents in a democratic voice over who the principal is going to be. And as a result, there has been a war in education circles, and it's been a divisive war across our country over whether we are to move towards charter schools, and often it's opposed by the teachers and their unions. And it's become a very divisive war. One of the things when we had the takeover in Providence, we were promised, was that it was not going to be a reopening of the education wars. Remember, the commissioner told a meeting of the Providence delegation that, quote, "We don't have time for that." And there are problems in the Providence public schools that are not about who has won or lost the education wars. For the most part, it's been the teachers who've lost. There's a very, very weak contract where it's basically pure management discretion to fire a teacher. It's just the school board and then an appeal to RIDE, and then that's it, enforced only by a union grievance. No long process where teachers get representation like we have for police. And it's become brutal. There's a contract battle that's dragged on for months and months and months, and the commissioner has threatened to, quote, do something drastic. And yet we saw a massive expansion of public schools targeted, or of charter schools targeted directly at Providence. An expansion that would blow a hole in the future of a public education system in our city. And so I hope the message that is sent by this bill is that we turn the takeover in Providence away from a reopening of the chapter of the education, another chapter of the education wars. We move beyond that fight, and instead we focus on fixing the public schools. We focus on making them better. We don't focus on turning this into yet another attack on the public schools themselves, on teachers, on their unions, on students and their rights. And so that is why I've gotten so many emails from my constituents begging me to support this bill. That's why I've heard such passionate pleas, really, from the teachers in our public schools, especially at our neighborhood public schools, about how much we need this legislation. So that's why I'm going to be voting for it today. But in some ways, I'm going to be voting for it both enthusiastically because we really need it, but sad also that we've come to this point, that we've had such brutal charter expansions and that we've reopened another chapter in the education wars. And I don't want to go through every charter application, but there's one part of one charter application that really stuck with me and really got to me. That's that there's a charter proposal that was approved by the Council on Elementary and Secondary Education that would take away summer break. The kids wouldn't get summer break, just two-week breaks. And summer break is important. It's important for kids to have the joy and the freedom of the summer, a time to relax. And I don't think it should all be about working them harder and harder and harder until maybe the test scores go up a little bit, but they're in tears and they're suffering. It's not much fun. So I think that we need to return joy to education. We need to return to an educational model that cares about the students, where the students are happy. Sometimes we don't talk about that enough. And I think it's important as we move beyond this unfortunate direction the takeover has taken, that we refocus on creating public schools where we can have joy. Public schools that the kids can enjoy, where they can learn to love learning. And so I must close by once again thanking everyone who has worked so hard on this bill. So many people in this chamber poured hours and hours into getting it right, from the top sponsors to the leadership to everyone who has worked so hard on this. And again, a thank you to the parents, to the teachers, to the students of Providence and across our state who've spoken up about why we need this legislation.
Senator Acosta.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you to all my colleagues who have shared so far. Americans are obsessed with individualism. It's this idea of choice, but we don't have the same levels of agency. So even those folks who were talking about, being and growing up in these tough, maybe under-resourced environments and then being able to move, what you're not recognizing is that everybody can't move. And so most of us here don't understand the experience of being trapped, right? Tupac said, "Picture me inside the misery of poverty. No man alive has ever witnessed struggles I survived." Now, luckily, there are more than a few Tupacs, and there are many of us who are growing up in these experiences. But not everybody's voice is worth the same. Many of us chose to move to neighborhoods based on the schools in those neighborhoods. Many of the parents and children in the schools that we're talking about don't have that same level of choice. The teachers who we're talking about chose this profession and chose to work at the schools in which they are teaching. Many of these kids and their parents did not have that same choice. And so when we think about whose voice we prioritize, I think it's important to keep that in mind. But it is far too easy to get caught up in talking about poverty, disadvantage, and the urban core. So let's talk about Barrington. In Barrington, in 2018, there were grades where less than 50% of kids were proficient in reading and math. The star gem of our state has grades where half of the kids can't read or do basic addition and subtraction. Opening and closing charter schools will not change that. Barrington does not have the same level of demand for charter schools that many of our urban core do, and those kids still can't read and do math. What are we doing about that? As a sociologist, I understand that our individual choices aggregate up to system-level inequalities. So when you look at the Blackstone Valley, you'll notice that there are cities with 30, 40, 60% black and brown kids. And right next door, there are so few kids of color in each grade that RIDE can't even report them. But even with all the resources, all the social and cultural capital in the world, why is it that kids in Barrington can't read and do basic math? Until we answer that question, everything else is political theater. If our kids can't read and do math, then the debates here don't matter. It doesn't matter if it's a charter school or a public school. If our star gem is getting outperformed by urban districts in Massachusetts, what are our schools doing? Now, to be fair to schools, and we realize this right now more than at any other time in our history, schools do way more than just teach. They provide an environment for development, for social exchange, for social learning. But when you close your eyes and you think about what you expect to come out of school, it is for your kid to be able to read, write, do math. We agree on that. And our schools cannot do that yet. And so until we figure that out, none of this stuff matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Acosta. Senator De Palma.
Mr. President, if I may, I don't want to be the skunk at the garden party, but I would also ask my colleagues on the floor, I know we will be doing rules in the coming weeks. We haven't done our rules yet, but we still have rules in place. We do have a five-minute rule for each, unless you're the minority-majority leader or asked up to come up. It's in Rule 7.1. I'm not going to read all the specifics. And it also asks that when you come up and speak, you speak to the presiding officer. That be the right now the Senator, the President, or whoever is the presiding officer at that time. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know you're a stickler for the rules. Senator Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I want to thank my colleagues for engaging on this topic, often so personally and eloquently. And I think I often say one of the hardest jobs I ever had in politics was that as a school committee member, because when you sit in a school committee, you're constantly dealing with parents, and there's nothing more personal to that parent than their kid. And so this should be an issue that we should all be animated about. This should be an issue that we spend a lot of time on. And so I feel somewhat responsible as the finance chair to address just the monetary issue. And as the whip indicated in her intro and in the bill and the findings, the impact of this decision, this preliminary decision, was a $92 million impact. Now, as the whip said, there's an existing law on the books that says that the approvals or expansions of charter schools are subject to state appropriation. And our duty each year when we pass a budget is to decide whether to appropriate funds to fund any school and every school. And what this bill is doing today is it's putting everyone on notice that the legislature has not yet identified a way to fund $92 million. And so resources of that magnitude have to be debated. That is our job. $92 million, you add that up, that's real money. And just 2 weeks ago, in the Senate Education Committee, we asked for a plan from the city of Providence. So the Providence number is $81 million for 5,062 students. We asked for a plan. And it's been 14 days. That plan has not arrived. And so at the end of the day, there's no plan to reduce $81 million out of the Providence school budget. Unless somebody has a pot of money that I'm not aware of, we're not sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars in excess resources. And this is the critical point. Everyone wants the best opportunity. Everyone wants to have the perfect school and the most curriculum and 2 teachers in a classroom and 8-hour school days. Everyone wants that, but choice costs money. And at the end of the day, we have to debate these issues. And so it is important and it is imperative that this moratorium be approved. It is without conscience that a board of the state could make a $92 million decision without a plan and without consulting with the legislature. So from a financial perspective, I think that's very clear. thinking through some of the arguments that I heard made by some of my colleagues today, and I've heard, elsewhere, we've talked about equity and fairness. And Senator De La Cruz had mentioned in her remarks about how we spend above average in per pupil spending in Rhode Island. And she's right. But one of the things that people would ask me after we had done the funding formula task force a year or so ago was, what worries you? And I would say, as a senator from Cumberland, what worries me is Woonsocket, Pawtucket, Central Falls, and Providence. And in that order. We talk so much about Providence, but no one talks about Woonsocket is a country mile behind Providence in their per pupil funding. That means there's no math coaches, there's no curriculum coordinators. They're trying to get a teacher to fill the classrooms up to the maximum size. So when we talk about statewide averages being higher, just because South Kingstown or Lincoln, a town that I represent, may spend a higher per pupil amount, does not take away from the fact that Woonsocket, Pawtucket, Providence, and Cumberland, by the way, spends less per pupil. That, and Central Falls, thank you, Senator. That distinction is really important. And the funding formula title is called the Education Equity and Property Tax Relief Act, meaning that the whole goal of the funding formula was to make sure that every student had equity in their funding. And we still haven't reached that goal. So while I appreciate the sentiment around equity and fairness, we have to make sure that we truly address that across all of our districts. Another statement that was made, the financial impact on the district is not about students. It is about students. If we don't think about the financial impact of the district, how are we making sure that those resources are available for those students? And also, another one, the moratorium will not fix the problem. That one I agree with. A moratorium will not fix the problem. This Senate has taken comprehensive action. Chairwoman Gallo led us just 2 years ago through comprehensive actions on curriculum and accountability that is currently in the works to be implemented. And taking $81 million out of the Providence school system as we're trying to make sure that they actually, which by the way, before Chairwoman Gallo's legislation, the Providence school system did not have uniform curriculum that was aligned to standards in the district. Taking $81 million out of that school system is not going to help us in getting that curriculum in the district. And so we know that the moratorium will not fix the problem, but we know that adding more charters won't. And if we want to just look, Central Falls is over 50% of their enrollment is in charter schools. Has that served as the panacea for Central Falls? No. State took that district over too. Has funded it. Over 50% charters, all state approved. Has it worked? For the 50% of kids that don't go to charters in Central Falls, I would argue it probably hasn't. So as we think about how we move forward, yes, we have to focus on improving our school system, but we have to have an adult conversation. You can't just say, we want all these options and not think about how that impacts others. And I appreciate the words of so many parents, and I said this in committee, of so many parents that came forward, and you can hear they want the best opportunity for their kids. And I would too, and I know all of you would too. But at the end of the day, our job is not as parents in this room. Our job is policymakers. And we have to consider, for all those parents that came forward in Providence and asked, I want to make sure that, my kid gets a great opportunity. And I understand that. What if their kid wasn't selected for one of those 5,000 lottery seats? So if we don't do this, and those 5,000 seats get added and $81 million comes out of the system, how would that parent feel if their child was not one of the 5,000 that got selected, and the district that they're sending their child to is $81 million less funded? I would argue they wouldn't want us to do that either. And so while this is a very tough issue, while it is emotional, it is completely about trying to think of what is in the best interest of every student in Rhode Island. And that's the lens we have to take. And I firmly believe this is the right piece of legislation at the right time. I want to thank Whip Goodwin for putting it in. I want to thank Chairwoman Cano for her leadership in making sure that this is a fully vetted and thought-through issue. And I want to thank the Senate for your indulgence. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Cano.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I'd like to say thank you to the sponsor of this legislation, Senator Goodwin, for the hard work, and all the co-sponsors and the people that are supporting it. I come before you today just with a little bit of sadness because there has been a significant amount of misinformation about this bill that, as a result, have been, by the Latino community leaders, have been making subject to inappropriate comments based on this information that is not true to Senator Quesada and I. This legislation is about children coming first. And one thing I'd like to say before I just make my remarks is that when I came here 20 years ago, this is the country of opportunity, and my parents basically definitely showed my brothers and I that school and education is a right that could lead us to a different path. So I do understand the importance of education. That's why when I graduated from school, I decided to run for a school committee in the town that has never had any diverse candidate or anybody that represents the community that reflects the diversity of Pawtucket. So I was elected to the school committee because I did believe, and I still do until this day, that we needed to fix our public traditional system because that system, quite honest, failed me when I was in high school. I remember that, and I say this a couple of times, that when I went to my counselor at the time, because they didn't really understand the community that I was serving, I said that I wanted to be a journalist. And that person told me, you have to forget about that because you're going to have an accent and you will never be successful at it. So that was my motivation to go back to that same school committee and try to fix it. And I know that my role there made significant impacts because I could represent the community that I deeply care about that was unrepresented. Why am I saying this? Is because that public service, I still have it in today, is true to me. And it makes me really sad that these comments by members of the Latino community are made by Senator Quesada and I saying, today Senator Cano and Senator Quesada are selling themselves to white supremacy, the ones that wants to keep our community ignorant and mistreated. Senator Cano and Senator Quesada are voting today to prohibit new charter schools. They don't want you as a parent to have a choice. They want your students to fail. They want to take you the right to choose, and that's why you need to call them, right? That's some of the comments that Senator Quesada and I have been subject to the past 2 weeks. And let me be clear. This bill would temporarily pause new charter school seats, and these seats that students have right now are not going anywhere. That statement was misinformation. This pause is necessary because the way that we fund in education is not equitable, and we need a little bit more of time to fix it. And thank you, Senator Pearson, for going into the finances of this, because I think it's important. But the Senate Funding Formula Task Force, which I was part of, held hearings. We learned that our education funding formula hurts some school districts that have high percentage of students in charter school, and it doesn't break even, and it hurts some other students. We cannot pick winners and losers. And I'll say that I was extremely proud as being the chair of the Senate Education Committee. For the first time in the history of the Senate, I was able to take testimony in Spanish. And Senator De La Cruz, I want to just make sure that I mention this. These parents were understood by Senator Quesada and I being in that committee. And I made sure that other members of the committee knew what they were saying because I took the time to translate for them. That's how important it is for me. This is the history of the Senate, giving the voice to every single person. And I'll tell you, it hurts because I care deeply about the Latino community, about the minority community, and everybody that knows me here knows that I'm not shy, and Senator Quesada is also not shy to fight for them in every single legislation that comes into the floor of this Senate. And that's why today I'm standing in front of you just to say that, I understand that my position will not please everybody, but as a public servant, it would be irresponsible of me to allow this funding system to continue knowing that it helps some people at the expense of everyone else. There are 140,000 students in Rhode Island, and I need to think all of them. What happens to the students who are not eligible to apply to certain charter schools? Or what about the students who apply but doesn't get selected in the lottery? What happens to them? They stay in their traditional public schools. There are many students who get lucky enough to attend charter schools of their choice, but are many more students that are staying in the traditional public school, and our funding system is hurting them today. There are ways to make the system better, and that is exactly what we are going to do, starting with the recommendations of that task force. However, we need to pause, adding new charter school seats while we are working to fix this problem. If we don't, the situation will only get worse, and that is not equitable. One more time, I want to say this. The bill doesn't ban new charter schools. It doesn't close charter schools. It doesn't take away a family's right to choose to send their children to charter schools. If that is what they think is best, that choice. This bill is a temporary pause so we can be thoughtful about how to change the funding system and provide opportunities to all students, not just some of them. Lastly, I want to close by saying that as a parent, I understand, and then in my personal life, I could have arguments with the people that I care about. My partner and I could be in different sides of the issue. But one thing somebody told me before, and I always take it with me, is that it is important that while we have debates about policy, and while we are in different sides of the issue, we respect the person, and we make sure that we are debating the issue and know the person. Because at the end of the day, we all care for the same thing. We care to make Rhode Island better, and we care to make this education system better. And if we don't agree, and I'm telling this to my Latino community, if you don't agree with me on this issue, don't try to tear apart the work that Senator Quesada and I have been doing in this chamber to also protect the community that we love and care for. Because you will be good with us in some issues, but if this one you disagree, allow us to have that conversation and allow us to work together to make it better. So like that, every single child in Rhode Island has the best quality education that they deserve. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chairwoman Cano. Senator De La Cruz. For the second time.
For the second time. I want to thank Senator Cano for those words, because I know she deeply cares about her community. But also, I think what's lacking really nowadays is the fact that you can't have healthy debate without taking it personally. And I actually remember when I first started in the Senate, the leader Algier had said to me, back in the day, we could fight on the floor, but then afterwards, we'd still shake hands and go out for a drink. And unfortunately, that's not happening today. So I do want to say thank you, Senator Cano. You did a great job in committee. I listened to the entire committee. I sat through it. I heard you interpret, even though I caught what they were saying. You did a fantastic job. And the other thing that I have said before, not to all of you, but to some of you, is that we all want the best for Rhode Island. We just believe differently about how to go about it. So I don't doubt for a minute, for a second, that anyone in this room doesn't care about Rhode Island and doesn't want to see these kids do well and prosper. So I want to put that to bed. But I do want to talk on the issue responding about governance, because that did come up, and I have a picture here, so I got to read it says here from again, Johns Hopkins report, it says, one of the problems outlined in the Johns Hopkins report, the scathing report, was that the governance of our schools was broken with multiple layers of bureaucracy, making it virtually impossible to get anything done. So I'm not going to repeat what I had just testified or spoke here before committee, but there is a governance issue. And what I'm hearing, not from everybody, but what I'm hearing is, we have a problem, but it's too big, so let's just throw our hands up and say, we can't do anything right now about it. But if something is important to us, we prioritize it. And there needs to be a level of urgency on this topic because it is an urgent matter. Again, one shot. These kids get one shot. They don't get a redo. If kids aren't reading and at level, doing the proper level of math by 3rd grade, they're behind for the rest of their educational career. This is a matter of urgency. So maybe we need to take another look. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator De La Cruz. Senator Gallo.
There's been a lot of passion here tonight. Okay, so as we know, this is a very controversial topic, but the status quo clearly is not working. We cannot fund 2 parallel systems. I've publicly expressed this and my reservations about this funding structure for quite some time. It's time to address it now. So we have to look at, as some of my colleagues were saying, that this is the choice that they want and they need to have it. Why do these parents want to enroll their children in the charter schools? Well, let's look at it. Who wouldn't want to have free after-school care? As we all know, anybody who's paid for after-school care, it's very expensive. So to have charter schools that just automatically have an after-school program, that's definitely something that you want. So maybe the regular public schools need to look at providing this and looking for the funding for it. If it's that important, maybe we need to include that. On the other side of this, charter schools need to look at educating our 3 to 5-year-old students as well as the 17 to 21-year-olds. They need to provide an education for the children with the IEPs. We can't just say, well, the regular public schools are going to deal with those 3 to 5 and the 17 to 21 that are the most needy out of our children. And without going into all of it, we all know how I feel, and most of us feel, about early education and addressing that and making sure that children don't need IEPs and they're taken care of as early as possible. We don't need to have winners and losers. By setting this up, it's not winners and losers. And I don't know how many people read the article by Joe Crowley this past week. It was in there. But he stated, learning gaps are not created by public schools. They're created by poverty. Those children don't have the same advantages, and the schools need to provide them. But it's not the public schools, and I will repeat that. I agree with him 100%. Public schools do not create learning gaps. Poverty does. We need to address this. It's urgent. We've talked about draining the money from regular public schools and its consequences. Everybody knows it. Senator Pearson did a nice job addressing all the money issues. I don't want to be repetitive. This temporary pause on new charter school seats will give us the time we need to be thoughtful about a very complicated issue. We need to make the system equitable for all students, not just some, all. And I ask you to support this, and I thank Senator Goodwin for sponsoring this legislation.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam Whip.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't want to belabor the point, and we've heard such impassioned discussion here. And thank you to all of my colleagues for their voices being heard on this important piece of legislation. I just wanted to add 2 points. Yes, to Senator De La Cruz. We're all aware of the Johns Hopkins report. And yes, it's heartbreaking. But I think Senator Gallo said it best, that so many of these causes are not just because teachers' contracts. And a lot of this is born out of poverty and no fault of anybody. But there are a lot of reasons why the school systems in Providence in particular, and I speak to Providence that's under a state takeover, are in the conditions that it are. But I wanted to speak for a minute to the Providence teachers, who really are angels on earth. If you knew Providence teachers like I do, and they do more, so much more than teach, and they're not paid for any of it. I mean, they bring clothes to children in the schools. I know personally of teachers that when students are missing, they'll climb 3rd floors in Smith Hill to see if those children and their families are all right. And I can go on and on and on. But I just wanted to say thank you to Senator Cano. I didn't start my speech off for her patience in hearing this bill. And I apologize, Senator, to you and Senator Casada. I would never imagine putting in a piece of legislation would bring such horrible comments to you and to the good work that you've done. I mean, really, really uncalled for. And I apologize. But your patience and your dedication in the hearing, I'll be forever grateful. 4 hours was a long time. I myself was on for the whole 4 hours. I just want to say thank you again to all my colleagues for your input. We're part of the process. We're not throwing up our hands. We're having a pause so that we can collectively address this very, very important issue. Thank you again, Mr. President, and I guess it's already been moved and seconded, so thank you.
Thank you, Madam Whip. On the act as amended, the clerk will please unlock the machine. If all members have recorded their vote, the clerk will lock the machine. There are 30 votes in the affirmative, 6 in the negative, and the act as amended passes.